Hello, I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP. And first and foremost, I would like to say thank you for viewing this video and subsequently visiting my channel. The topic of this video will be on the expression of personal experience, and it will essentially be an argument for why I do not accept nor think it's appropriate for people to describe their personal experience as the general phenomenon of any one type's experience. I think typology works like this, as in personality is a biological construction that emerges from one's temperament. As temperament is something that is completely genetically determined, personality is something by way of the interplay between the genetic material and the individual's environment, as it can be parsimony that one's distinct characteristics, as in their tendencies to be exploratory, disagreeable, conscientious, and a various number of 5 traits in terms of what the Big Five model postulates, is a very much of a about 50, depending on what research you look at, it's 50 to 80% of the genetic picture. So there's 50 to 20% of somebody that they get from sort of a constructive process by way of their interplay between the genetics and epigenetic phenomenon and social constructions. And I think epigenetic phenomenon take up 10% of that piece. So again, the social component, if it's 1 takes to 50 estimate, is only 40%. Or like epi can have 10 to 20 maybe. So still, it's a conglomerations of things that make up the personality, even that so. But there's something that's deeper than personality, as in there's a default setting, as we are genetically human. So there are deeper drives at the root of what we see as personality theory that can have coloration and variance in of themselves. As I've made videos before, I think that there are things that exist as what I call superordinate traits, ordinate traits, and subordinate traits. Personality would be something within the stratum of some aspects of it being superordinate, some aspects of it being ordinate. I don't think any aspects of it are completely subordinate, as in they are completely plastic, as in there's ordinacy in my description of ordinacy of aspects to someone's personality, complex characteristics, traits, behaviors, and expressions has to do with the degree of plasticity that something has to it. And things that don't have a great deal of plasticity and have a greater superimposing structure on one's psyche, as in you can take somebody who has a personality disorder and there's not a lot you can do about that personality disorder outside of it depends on the degree, because if somebody suffers from chronic depression, severe chronic depression, they can take medication and the medication will alleviate the symptomization of what it is they experience, but it will never ever get rid of the disposition towards depression. They will never not be a depressive in their life. Same thing for somebody who's manic, or somebody who's highly intelligent per se. There will be nothing that one can do or that the environment can do outside of pharmaceuticals or surgery and other things like lobotomies and various altering of physiological aspects per se, complete alterations of physiological aspects that will change that trait or the expression of that trait in the individual. The more rigid something is and the less malleable and susceptible it is to change, the greater it gets on the hierarchy of ordinancy in my system or my conception of personality and typology. And I think personality is something that is in between the ordinate spectrum and the superordinate, as in there's complexes that exist in the superordinate, there's complexes that exist in the ordinate, but really very few things exist in the subordinate, are as in behavioral patterns per se. And even the subordinate things that can exist, as in things that are very, very plastic, have to do with very real biological and innate underpinnings that make the malleability in a sense susceptible. But there are things such as forms of crystallized intelligence that are very, very malleable and are extremely plastic. And so there's a piece of that's something that's important to say off on the offset, as in I think very really that there's variations in people, because personality exists at certain levels of resolution, and that's not the whole picture of somebody's experience, and who it is somebody is, their behaviors, what they tend to be drawn to, their patterns and tendencies of neuroticism even. And because as neuroticism, it very really is a superordinate trait, because neuroticism has a great deal of correlation to anxiety disorders, and people who tend to be rather neurotic are in some way along the lines of anxiety compulsory disorders, as OCD, or depressive disorders. And neuroticism is the tendency to experience negative emotion, which is a superordinate trait. It's something like a personality disorder, but in the Big Five model, or the trait model per se, it's something that has its own independent dimension, and people will load one way or the other in terms of neuroticism. People will load one way or the other in terms of agreeableness or aggression. People will load in some way, and these things were decided per se by genetic phenomenon, and they're not things that move very much. You can teach people skills, and you can teach people coping mechanisms, and you can give people medicine, and you can do surgery, and you can do things to mitigate, but you will never actually change what they are per se as individuals. It's not to say things like criminality or anything like that. That when you have classifications, necessarily those things aren't superordinate. So if somebody is going to be a prostitute or a criminal or anything that society deems as negative, that's not to say that they are just that way and that's the way that they are, because there's a conglomerations of things that make anything up, even being a scientist per se. Like, I'm not a natural born scientist, I'm a natural born creative, exploratory person, and somebody who's concerned with consistency in information and categorical reasoning. And those things tend to come together to make me apt to be a scientist or a mathematician. But the thing is that I'm not those things innately, as there's a great deal of training and culturization that has to occur for me to even be one of those things. And that's to say this, that when people talk, it's just that there's a limit and a dimension and scope that personality fits, and I don't think people very really consider these things, or that they think outside of the conception, particularly if they're lay typologists, they think outside of the conception of the Jungian model, and they don't take into account the greater fields of biology, cognitive science, neuroscience, and what else psychology can tell us in terms of research and literature, and just what behaviorists think, what depth psychologists think, what evolutionary psychologists think, what different schools of psychology tell us, and the picture that's best pulled out of that by way of cognitive science, neuroscience, chemistry, and biology and physics, really. And that's kind of what I use those things for. As psychology is more of an engineering type of field, as in psychologists have to use factors of cognition and the way that humans are made up to decide value metrics and things that are acceptable per se in terms of behavior and action and orientation and one's creation of society and things like that. So they're not necessarily scientists in the truest sense, as they're applied scientists. They're more like physicians and doctors in some respects. And I would not tell one to just take what a doctor is saying completely on its face value without just the consideration of larger parameters per se, and combing that information or comparing that information to itself. You don't want to have a house of mirrors effect going on, because you can't really get outside of the paradigm or the scope of whatever that is, and sometimes you need that greater perspective really to get an idea of what can be considered fixed, what can be considered what is a proper orientation for consideration of the categorization of things. And it's just that we're too flippant in some respects and less likely to think of certain things. It's just that people take their individual experience and automatically I think, irrationally assume that it's descriptive of the entirety. And even is to say that there's a lot of coloration around a mean, and most people fit in it, but that's not necessarily where you're at in everything, and you're a conglomeration of things. It's just to say that I think when people say this is what it's like to be a type, I don't like that. It's inaccurate. It's not what it's like to be a type. It's what it's like to be you. What it's like to be you and what it's like to be that type are different things. As you are that type, but you are just an expression of that type. You're not the archetypal expression or the truest venality of what it means to be that type. As in, I think that you would have to have a very specific genetic template and dispositions of traits necessarily in the right volume and coloration to be exactly that type. And if you were exactly that type, you wouldn't seem human, I don't think. I don't think you would seem normal, or you would very much appear to be an exception. You would appear extreme to a lot of people, because the things that typify a type essentially are the conglomerations of consistent and invariant patterns within a multitude and a breadth of individuals, and these things have been drawn together to give the type descriptions that you read or what Jung talks about. And it's not necessarily just it's at one level of resolution, which is the grandest resolution of analyses, but when you get on the specific level, there are things that are superordinate, that are not just aspects of personality in of themselves, but are aspects of cognition and aspects of what it means to be human, and aspects that are things like height. So, for example, height is going to affect the way that somebody sees the world very really. It is, because there's multiple genetic reasons for that, and social reasons in terms of human behavior. And same thing, and there's various things like embodied traits that will say more. Physical appearance and attractiveness is one of those things, that there are embodied traits that don't have anything necessarily to do with one's personality, that are going to color their perspective and how they see the world and how they appear in the world, because of how by the way, the social componency of what it means to be human, and the philosophical aspects of what it means to be human, and the type of expectation that they've been given by society and things, and sort of the freedoms and different things that they have. It's just that there are more things at play than just personality. I think personality is fundamental and deep and at the root of things, but it's not the all-encompassing explanation for everything in terms of behavior and motivation. I think it can explain a lot about motivation. I think personality and evolutionary psychology and cognitive science and neuroscience are all one needs to explain human motivation. And as those pictures grow, as personality theory grows, because it is an independent subject of research in psychology, outside of just the thoughts that Jung came up with, as these things grow, we will only understand the human animal more. Will we ever be able to make predictions and things like that? No, because it's too damn complicated, I think, in a lot of ways. But I get rather anxious, I would say, and a bit worried when people make videos like "this is what it is to be that type." I think if you make something like that, you have to do a general analysis and not use yourself as any type of metric per se, other than a small aspect of some larger conglomeratory whole. As in, you got to have a rather larger sample size than that of one, because I promise you that's not going to be accurate. Even if there is a small minority per se, it's a minority nonetheless, and what you're talking about is a general phenomenon. Minorital statistics cannot tell us the general story. They can have some way in orientating us towards the general description per se, as in what do the extremes look like and what can be the ultimate variance, as in we need to tease apart the picture and not make it as rigid per se to certain parameters. So what things do we find are invariant, and what things, like when you look at the general populace, and when you look at the minorities per se, just what do you find in between the two that seems to be most invariant between those populations, and we can tease those traits out as being the ones that are the most indicative of what a population of people in its totality really represents or is. But to take anything from the one and not consider it with the other in any comparative way is bad analyses. It's really awful analyses and problematic, really, in a statistical sense. And I know this as my training as a scientist, but it is something innately in me, as well as an extroverted, intuitive type, as in you want to collect as many impressions and experiences as you can and sort of conglomerate them all and aggregate them all into a way and organize and codify them in a certain way, and judge them and render judgments based off of many cases. Many cases. One case is not good enough. It's just not, unless you start from some first order principle to that is so deep and penetrating that you can kind of get over that. But even most INTPs, like, they don't ever get over that, and even Einstein didn't get over that. You start from there and pull out some general universal pattern and principle by way of all the things that you've seen and see this consistent trend here, and can extract that and use that as the foundational piece because it shows to be the thing that's invariant and internal. And if you haven't done that, don't think for a second that you're getting to the general description. And it's not appropriate nor accurate, really, to say that your general description, your own personal experience is a general description. That's logically not correct. And people are free to say whatever they want and do whatever they want, very really, but that bothers me because it's, to me, a cheapening of things, as in it's non-accurate representation, and I don't like non-accurate representation. And I would say that, very really, I don't even consider myself as the general description of an INTP. There's a lot of INTPs, and there's a lot of people that say that I am the typical INTP, or I'm the epitome or the typifying element of introverted thinking. A lot of times people consider me introverted thinking. They use me as an example of what introverted thinking is. I don't think that just because, I think there's very many reasons that have to do outside of topology for the explanation of how I approach information. Very really, I do know that I am a dominant introverted thinker, and for whatever it's worth, that in Dario Nardi's test of cognition, I've taken that, and the thing I don't like is their questionnaires per se, at least online, and I haven't been under any MRI or had a CAT scan done or even any EKG. But I would suspect that the dominance of activity within my brain exists in the frontal regions, both bilaterally in the right and the left hemisphere in some respects, as I really do think that there's other reasons per se, IQ being one of them, and what I know from that research. It's just that there's a lot of different things that colorate or give the impression that don't have anything to do with introverted thinking, that do influence introverted thinking, and somewhat, I would say, amplify it very really. Also, that the amount of study and research and schooling I do, as in I have a tendency towards intellection. I load on openness to experience, high on the aesthetics aspect of it, and then high on the intellectual aspect of it. But I think independent, which should be teased from intelligence, I don't think intelligence is a good component to openness to experience. I think intelligence or IQ should have its own thing by itself, and intellection should be the other aspect, because I know people who aren't very smart, in terms of having really high IQs, but they do like to think, and they do like to solve problems, and they generally like cognitive stimulation, and I think that's a trait of intellection, and it's a trait in of its own self, and I do load highly in that. So, and because there's highly intelligent people or people with high IQ that don't have the trait of intellection. They just don't care necessarily about intellectual matters. They care to use their IQ to get what they want, and they're pretty lazy in their thinking. And they're okay with using it to structure things and orientate themselves towards the solving, the resolution of objects in the environment and things like that, or maintaining arguments and things of that nature, but they're not very exploratory and they're not very interested in challenging themselves or being intellectually challenged very really. They seem to be averse in that, and that's a very real